Dance this waltz, or you're just another invisible part of the decor. The tech billionaire sneered, his voice cutting through the opulent hum of the gala. The entire grand hall, a sea of silk and diamonds, turned to watch as he thrust a serving girl into the spotlight. The ridicule was a tidal wave, meant to drown her in shame, to shatter her into a spectacle of humiliation. But as she stood there, poised and unbroken, they had yet to realize the woman they scorned was not a servant to be broken, but a queen in hiding. The air in the Metropolis Vanguard Gala's grand ballroom was thick enough to taste. It was a cocktail of vintage perfume, ambition, and the metallic tang of old money mingling with the brash scent of new wealth. Crystal chandeliers, like frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto the gilded mirrors and marble floors, reflecting 1,000 glittering versions of the city's elite. For Ilara Vance, the reflections were a constant reminder of her invisibility. She was 26, though the severe, tight bun holding back her dark brown hair and the stark absence of makeup made her seem both older and younger at once. Her uniform, a plain black dress and a crisp white apron, was a shield, a cloak of professional anonymity. It was a size too big, deliberately chosen to obscure the lines of a body that had once been celebrated for its grace. She moved through the glittering throng with a practiced economy of motion, a heavy silver tray laden with champagne flutes balanced perfectly in her hands. She was a ghost at the feast, her presence acknowledged only by the empty glasses she collected. There was, however, something about her that defied the uniform. It was in the unwavering level of her chin, the straight, proud line of her spine. It was a dancer's posture, an ingrained discipline that years of deliberate obscurity could not erase. While the women around her dripped with diamonds and laughed with practiced, airy trills, Ilara's stillness was a quiet rebellion. Her silence was not one of submission, but of observation. From her vantage point, she saw the world she had once brushed against, a world of hollow compliments and alliances forged over canapes, a world she had fled. The string quartet in the corner began a new piece, a hauntingly familiar waltz. The melody coiled around her heart, threatening to pull a memory to the surface, a memory of laughter, of worn-out ballet slippers, of a voice whispering, "You'll make them all cry someday." Ilara, her sister, Clara. She pushed the memory down, a familiar and practiced motion of the soul, locking it away behind the professional calm of her expression. That was when his eyes found her. Preston Sterling stood near the grand fireplace, a veritable king in his court. He was the young, charismatic, and utterly ruthless CEO of Nexus Dynamics, a tech empire built on aggressive innovation and even more aggressive takeovers. His suit was a razor-sharp testament to his tailor's skill, his dark hair slicked back from a face that was handsome in a cold, predatory way. He held his wine glass with a casual arrogance, his fingers drumming against the crystal as he surveyed his domain. He wasn't looking for a drink, he was bored. The sycophants surrounding him, laughing too loudly at his jokes, had become tedious. His gaze swept the room, dismissive and hungry, until it landed on the quiet girl in the server's uniform. He saw her posture, her serenity amidst the chaos, and he took it not as dignity, but as an affront. How dare someone so insignificant possess a composure that he, with all his billions, had to project? He decided, in that moment, that he would shatter it. It would be a fine piece of evening entertainment. Well, what do we have here? Preston's voice, amplified by the room's acoustics and his own self-importance, sliced through the chatter. A pocket of silence formed around him, spreading like a ripple in a pond. Ilara froze, the tray in her hands suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She knew that tone. It was the sound of a predator toying with its prey. She kept her back to him, hoping he was speaking to someone else, anyone else. "I'm talking to you," he said, his voice closer now. He had moved to stand directly behind her, the serving girl with the posture of a palace guard. A few nervous titters broke the silence. Ilara closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, her knuckles white where she gripped the tray. She turned slowly, her face a carefully blank canvas. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice was low and even, betraying none of the frantic pounding in her chest. Preston's lips curled into a smirk. He reveled in the attention. The entire gala was now his audience. "You can," he said, gesturing with his glass toward the polished dance floor. This party is becoming a dreadful bore. The music is divine, but the people are predictable. He let his gaze drift over his own guests with theatrical disdain before it settled back on Alara, sharp and cruel. You, however, seem to be hiding something. All that rigidity. It needs to be shaken loose. He took another step, invading her personal space. She could smell the expensive cologne and the wine on his breath. So, here's the deal, he announced to the room. Dance this waltz, or you're just another invisible part of the decor. The full weight of his words landed. It wasn't a request. It was a command, a public humiliation designed for maximum effect. The titters swelled into a wave of outright laughter. It was a cascade of sharp, glittering things, beautiful on the surface but designed to cut. A maid dancing a waltz? A woman in a ruby necklace whispered to her companion, her voice carrying easily, "Preston is deliciously wicked." She'll probably trip over her own feet. Her companion, a man with a Rolex that flashed under the light, snorted. This will be better than the hired entertainment. Alara's world narrowed. The opulent room, the jeering faces, the shimmering lights, it all faded into a blurry periphery. All that existed was the polished floor, the insidious melody of the waltz, and the smug face of Preston Sterling. Her first instinct, the one that had governed her life for the past 7 years, was to flee, to murmur an apology, turn, and disappear back into the shadows of the service corridors. It would be easy. It was what they expected. But then she saw it in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he had already won, the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no, who believed his wealth gave him the right to treat another human being as a plaything. And something inside her, a long-dormant ember of defiance, flickered to life. The same fire that had fueled her through 16-hour training days, through injuries and exhaustion, the fire she thought had been extinguished on a rain-slicked road 7 years ago. She did not flinch. She did not drop the tray. Her eyes, a deep and steady brown, met his. In their depths, a quiet strength gathered, a storm that nobody in this room had the foresight to see. Over in a corner, near the catering station, a young waiter named Leo watched, his own tray trembling so violently that a glass on it rattled softly. He was barely 19, and his face was pale with a mixture of fear and outrage. He'd seen Alara in the staff room before the event started. She kept to herself, her movements efficient and quiet. While others complained about demanding guests or sore feet, she would simply read a worn paperback, her expression distant. He felt a desperate urge to step forward, to say something, anything. But the sight of Preston Sterling, surrounded by a dozen of the most powerful people in the city, froze the words in his throat. His fingers tightened on his tray, the metal digging into his skin. He was a coward, and he hated himself for it. A woman near him, her voice dripping with the false pity of the privileged, murmured, "Oh, that poor thing, she must be absolutely mortified." Leo's jaw clenched. Mortified? She looked like a statue carved from granite. He saw Alara's eyes briefly flick in his direction. It was a glance so fleeting he might have imagined it, but in that instant, he saw no panic. He saw a calm, resolute focus, as if she were preparing not for humiliation, but for a performance. With a steadiness that silenced some of the closer whispers, Alara walked to a nearby table. She set her heavy silver tray down. She did not rush. Each champagne flute was placed with the deliberate care of a museum curator arranging priceless artifacts. The small, precise movements were a stark contrast to the ugly chaos unfolding around her. When the tray was empty, she smoothed the front of her simple black dress. It was a small, almost insignificant gesture, but it was done with an air of finality. She then turned to face Preston Sterling and the waiting crowd. The grand ballroom suddenly felt like an arena. Every eye was on her. They were vultures, waiting for the fall, eager to feast on her failure. The event's MC, a man with a spray tan and a microphone he wielded like a scepter, couldn't resist joining the sport. "Well, folks," his voice boomed through the speakers, laced with cheap amusement. "Looks like we have some unscheduled audience participation tonight. Let's give a big hand to our brave volunteer." The laughter swelled again, a roaring tide of scorn. Preston Sterling's grin widened. This was perfect. Better than he had even imagined. He stepped closer, his voice a low, condescending purr that still carried to every corner of the room. "Come on, sweetheart," he coaxed, his tone mocking the term of endearment. "Don't be shy. The stage is yours. Show us what you've got." He gestured expansively to the empty dance floor, a grand prince offering a crumb to a peasant. He expected tears. He expected a panicked retreat. He expected a clumsy, awkward shuffle that would send the room into new gales of laughter. He did not expect Alara Vance to take a single, graceful step forward into the center of the light. He did not expect her to place one hand gently on the hem of her plain uniform dress. And he certainly did not expect her to dip into a small, perfect, breathtakingly elegant curtsy, a dancer's reverence. It was so precise, so effortless. It was like a line of poetry spoken in a room of noise. The old violinist in the string quartet, a man with wispy gray hair and the weary eyes of someone who had played for crowds like this for 50 years, stopped his bow mid-stroke. His eyes widened in disbelief. He knew that curtsy. He had seen it before, not in a ballroom filled with arrogant billionaires, but on the grand stages of Vienna and Moscow. He had seen it performed by the prima ballerinas, by the world champions, by artists who commanded the stage with a single, reverent gesture. A hush began to fall over the room. It started with those closest, those who saw the impossible grace in that simple movement. The laughter faltered, dying in people's throats. Preston's predatory grin wavered, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. Alara rose from her curtsy, her back straight, her chin high. She did not look at him. She did not look at the crowd. Her gaze was distant, fixed on a point in the middle distance, as if seeing a different stage, a different time. The conductor of the quartet, catching the eye of the stunned violinist, hesitated for only a moment before he lifted his baton. The music began anew, a waltz, slow and elegant, the kind of melody that demanded perfection. And Alara Vance, the invisible serving girl, took her first step. The first note of the waltz hung in the air, a perfect, crystalline thing. Alara's first step was not a step at all, but a release. It was as if she had been holding her breath for 7 years, and the music was the exhalation. Her foot did not simply land on the marble, it greeted it, a soft, sure-footed glide that spoke of an intimacy with the rhythm of the world. Her body flowed into the movement, not with the hesitation of someone remembering, but with the profound certainty of someone who had never been allowed to forget. The laughter did not stop all at once. It sputtered and died in patches, like a fire being starved of oxygen. A few guests, too absorbed in their wine or their own wit, continued to chuckle for a moment longer, their amusement sounding suddenly harsh and foolish in the rapidly quieting hall. Heads lifted. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations trailed off into confused whispers. They had expected a spectacle of clumsiness, a fawn stumbling in the headlights. They were met with the fluid grace of a swan taking to water. Preston Sterling, his smirk still clinging to his lips, saw the shift in the room's atmosphere and mistook it for a lull. His ego, vast and fragile, could not comprehend that her grace was genuine. To him, it must be a fluke, a lucky first step. He needed to reassert his control, to become the ringmaster of this circus once more. He strode onto the floor, his movements aggressive and proprietary. "Not bad for a start," he said, his voice a low growl meant only for her. But a waltz requires two. He did not offer his hand. He took hers. His grip was a vice, his fingers digging into her own with bruising force. It was a gesture of ownership, an attempt to physically impose his will upon her. He pulled her into a dance position, his left hand pressing heavily against the small of her back, forcing her uncomfortably close. He thought he would lead, thought he would steer this humiliation to its intended conclusion. He spun her hard, a jarring, ungraceful rotation designed to make her stumble, to twist her ankle in her sensible, flat work shoes. His eyes, cold and challenging, dared her to fall. "She'll fall any second," whispered a woman named Genevieve, her neck draped in a collar of diamonds that seemed to tighten with her judgment. She was the wife of a hedge fund titan, a woman whose entire identity was built on the stability of a rigid social order. A serving girl who could dance threatened that order. "This isn't an amateur's training floor," added the man beside her, a cocky tech startup founder named Cade, whose tie was artfully loosened as if to signal he owned the world. "Sterling will put her in her place." The crowd watched, their eyes like blades, waiting for the stumble, the falter, the trip that would prove them right. It would confirm their belief that a person's worth was dictated by their station, that talent could not possibly exist beneath a servant's uniform. But Alara did not fall. The moment Preston's hand clamped down on hers, a jolt went through her, not of fear, but of instinct. Her body, a vessel of discipline and memory, responded before her mind could process the insult. She absorbed the force of his brutish spin, her core tightening, her feet instinctively adjusting. Where he was rigid, she was fluid. Where he was force, she was water. She did not fight his lead. She flowed around it, turning his clumsy aggression into a mere current in the river of her own movement. The music swelled, and something deep within her unlocked. The grand hall, with its gilded fixtures and mocking faces, began to recede. The polished marble beneath her feet became the sprung-wood floor of 1,000 practice studios. The scent of expensive perfume was replaced by the familiar aroma of rosin and sweat. The cruel laughter faded into the echo of her sister Clara's voice, counting out the beat with unwavering encouragement. 1, 2, 3. "You've got this, Alara. Feel the music." Preston spun her again, faster this time, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. His confident smile was beginning to slip as he realized she wasn't just keeping up. She was dancing circles around him, metaphorically and literally. Her steps were flawless, each one a perfect, whispered syllable in the language of the waltz. His own movements, by contrast, were becoming sloppy, his feet struggling to keep time, his confidence cracking like thin ice under pressure. He was a man used to controlling boardrooms and markets, but here, on this floor, he was an amateur, and he was being exposed. The old violinist in the corner saw it all. He saw the girl's sublime technique and the billionaire's clumsy rage. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the conductor. The conductor understood. With a flick of his wrist, the tempo of the waltz quickened, the melody becoming more intricate, more demanding. It was a challenge, a test laid down by the musicians themselves. Preston began to sweat. The faster pace exposed his every flaw. He was leading with his shoulders. His steps were heavy, his timing off. He was no longer dancing. He was merely trying not to fall. And then it happened. In a seamless, breathtaking moment, Alara spun out of his bruising grip. For a single, suspended beat, she danced alone in the center of the floor, a solitary figure of impossible grace. Before Preston could reclaim his hold, before he could even process what had occurred, she moved back toward him. But this time, she did not offer her hand to be taken. Without a word, she took the lead. Her right hand gently but firmly found his shoulder blade, guiding him. Her left hand enveloped his, her grip not forceful but undeniably in control. Her steps now set the rhythm. She was no longer responding to him. She was compelling him to respond to her. The room fell into a silence so profound it felt as if all the air had been sucked out. People weren't just watching anymore. They were transfixed. Some leaned forward, their elbows on the damask tablecloths. Others sat back, their hands frozen on their glasses, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, reluctant awe. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely, devastatingly inverted. The peasant was leading the king, and she was making it look effortless. At a nearby table, Genevieve's perfectly manicured nails, painted a glossy, venomous red, tapped against her wineglass. "She's making a fool of him," she hissed. Her eyes narrowed as Alara guided a floundering Preston across the floor. Her companion, a man with a slick mustache who had spent the evening name-dropping, chuckled nervously. "She can't keep this up. She's just a nobody." But his words faltered as Alara executed a flawless pivot, her movement so precise it seemed to carve the air. Genevieve's tapping stopped, her hand frozen midair as if caught in a spotlight. As Alara and Preston swept past their table, Alara's gaze flicked in their direction for less than a second. It wasn't a glare. It was just a glance, calm and level, but in it they felt the full weight of their own misjudgment. Whispers began to circulate, no longer of mockery, but of frantic speculation. Maybe she took a few classes, a politician's aide muttered, his voice uncertain as he tried to rationalize what he was seeing. No way, a fashion influencer across from him, a woman with surgically perfect eyebrows, shook her head. You don't learn that in a few months. That's years of work. Still, the skepticism clung to the air like smoke. They were not ready to let go of their comfortable prejudices. She's still just a maid, Cade, the tech founder, insisted, his voice carrying across the table. No record, no titles. This is probably just a fluke, a party trick. A young reporter nearby, notepad forgotten in her lap, laughed a short, disbelieving laugh. An illusion. That's all this is. But the illusion refused to break. With every turn, every perfectly executed step, Alara's presence grew. She was no longer a servant in a black dress. She was the music made manifest. The polished floor was her kingdom, and the stunned silence of the city's elite was her crown. She moved with a bittersweet sorrow and a fierce burning joy, her body telling a story that no one in the room could read, but everyone could feel. It was a story of loss and survival, of a talent so profound it could not be buried, no matter how deep one tried to dig the grave. Preston was now merely a prop in her performance. His face was a mask of crimson humiliation, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. He had started this to be the center of attention, and he had succeeded, but not in the way he had ever imagined. He was the fool in her masterpiece, the bumbling counterpoint to her sublime melody, forever bound to a dance of his own making, a waltz of his public undoing. And Alara, the invisible girl, danced on. The waltz surged toward its crescendo. Alara was no longer dancing with Preston. She was dancing with the ghost of the girl she used to be. The marble floor was a canvas, and her feet were painting a masterpiece of sorrow and strength. Each turn was a memory, each extension a wordless cry. She moved through a sequence of steps so complex, so breathtakingly difficult, that even those who knew nothing of dance understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. It was a fleckerlo, a series of rapid, rotating pivots that demanded absolute precision and control. Preston, trapped in her orbit, was thrown completely off balance, his feet tangling, his expensive shoes scuffing the floor in a desperate attempt to keep up. He was a marionette whose strings had been seized by a master puppeteer. The humiliation was a physical thing now, a suffocating heat rising from his collar. His perfectly styled hair was damp with sweat, his face a blotchy, furious red. He had wanted to make her a spectacle, and he had succeeded. But the spectacle was his own. Across the room, Serafina, the fashion influencer, was no longer watching with detached amusement. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows were drawn together in a knot of intense concentration. The skepticism had vanished, replaced by a frantic, dawning recognition that gnawed at the edges of her memory. That posture, that specific turn of the head, the impossible fluidity of that fleckerle, it was not just professional, it was iconic. "There's no way," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. She fumbled in her Chanel clutch for her phone, her fingers clumsy with haste. Her screen lit up her face, her thumb flying across the keyboard. Her search was specific, desperate. World Waltz champion Vienna disappeared 7 years ago. The search results loaded in an instant. The first hit was a grainy video thumbnail from a World Championship final. The second was an article with a headline that made her gasp. She clicked it. There on the screen, frozen in time, was a younger version of the girl on the dance floor. Maybe 19, her face flushed with victory, her dark hair cascading over the shoulders of a magnificent, flowing crimson gown. In her hands, she held a massive golden trophy high above her head. The smile on her face was radiant, pure, a supernova of joy. The caption beneath the photo read, "Elegance, the Viennese comet, stuns the world with a perfect score before vanishing from the competitive circuit." "My God," Serafina whispered, her phone clattering onto the table. It's her. The man beside her leaned over. Who? It's her! Serafina's voice rose, cracking the spell of the music. She snatched her phone and stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the marble. I know who she is, she shouted, her voice cutting through the hall like a shard of glass. The music faltered for a beat. The conductor turned, annoyed, but saw the look on her face, the phone held out like a holy relic. That's Alara Vance, she cried out, her voice trembling with the magnitude of her discovery. She was the world dance champion, the champion from Vienna. The words detonated in the silent hall. A collective gasp, a sharp, unified intake of breath, swept the room. For a moment, there was nothing but the lingering notes of the waltz and the frantic sound of 100 smartphones being unlocked. A digital wildfire erupted. Keyboards clicked. The name Alara Vance was typed, searched, and shared. Faces, once masks of scorn and amusement, were now illuminated by the bluish glow of their screens, their expressions morphing into slack-jawed astonishment. Images of Alara in her crimson gown, Alara with her gold trophy, Alara mid-flight in the arms of a partner, filled the small screens, a ghostly gallery of a life they had just tried to mock into oblivion. On the dance floor, Preston Sterling finally broke away. He stumbled back from Alara as if she had physically burned him. The revelation had struck him like a punch to the gut, winding him, stealing his breath and his bravado. He stared at her, at the quiet, unassuming girl in the server's uniform, and tried to reconcile her with the triumphant champion on a dozen phone screens around him. The cognitive dissonance was too much. His entire worldview, built on a foundation of money and status, was crumbling. He lashed out, his voice loud and brittle, a pathetic attempt to reclaim some shred of his shattered authority. That was years ago, he snapped, his voice cracking. So what? Look at her now. She's nothing, just a lowly maid serving drinks. A few guests nodded weakly, clinging to his words as if to a life raft, desperate to restore the social order they understood. A faded star, Genevieve murmured, her voice dripping with a pity more venomous than her earlier scorn. How tragic. The laughter that followed was thin, forced, like a dying cough. They were trying to convince themselves, but Alara didn't seem to hear them. The music was coming to its end. As Preston retreated, she did not stop. The floor was hers now, completely and utterly. She danced the final bars of the waltz alone, a solo performance of exquisite and heartbreaking beauty. She moved not for the crowd, not for their shock or their sudden, worthless admiration. She moved for herself. She danced for the ghost of a girl in a red dress, and for the sister who had been in the front row of every competition, clapping louder than anyone. The final note of the waltz played, long and sorrowful. Alara's movements slowed, her body coiling into a final pose. It was not a triumphant flourish. It was a position of quiet grace, one arm extended, as if reaching for someone who wasn't there, her head bowed, her eyes closed. She held the pose for a long, silent moment, a living statue of memory and loss. The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper and more profound than the shocked silence from before. This was a silence of reverence. No one dared to breathe. They were no longer looking at a serving girl. They were looking at an artist who had just bled her soul onto the marble floor. A single, tentative clap broke the stillness. It came from the old violinist, who had lowered his bow and was now standing, his eyes glistening with tears. Then another clap, and another. The applause started slowly, then built, swelling into a thunderous, rolling wave of sound that shook the crystal chandeliers. It was a desperate, frantic applause, as if the crowd was trying to atone for their cruelty, to wash away their shame with noise. But just as the ovation reached its peak, a heavy, resounding thud echoed through the hall. The grand oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with force, pushed by unseen hands. Every head turned. The applause faltered, then died away completely, replaced by a sudden, tense quiet. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with sharp, intelligent features and a mane of silver hair. There was an aura of immense, unshakable power about him, a stillness that made Preston Sterling's bluster seem childish by comparison. He was Julian Thorne, the reclusive billionaire philanthropist, a legendary patron of the arts, whose influence was so vast it was spoken of in whispers. He was a man who could build an opera house with a single phone call and destroy a career with a single, disappointed glance. He didn't look at the stunned MC. He didn't look at the gawking crowd. He didn't even spare a glance for the humiliated, trembling form of Preston Sterling. His gaze, cool and appraising, moved across the entire room and settled, with absolute focus, on the one person who mattered. He walked straight toward Alara Vance. Julian Thorne's footsteps were the only sound in the cavernous hall. The expensive leather of his shoes made a soft, deliberate rhythm against the marble, a slow, inexorable march toward the center of the room. The crowd parted for him as if by an invisible force, their awe for Alara's talent now eclipsed by their fear and reverence for the man approaching her. He was a kingmaker, a titan whose wealth was not in technology or hedge funds, but in the priceless currency of culture and influence. To be acknowledged by him was an honor. To be ignored by him was a sentence. He stopped a respectful distance from Alara, who had finally lowered her arm and stood breathing softly, her composure absolute. The thunderous applause might as well have been the whisper of the wind for all the effect it had on her. She met Julian Thorne's gaze, not as a supplicant, but as an equal. In that moment, she was not Alara Vance the waitress, nor even Alara Vance the former champion. She was simply an artist, and he, a connoisseur who recognized true mastery. "It has been a long time since I've seen a waltz danced with such honesty, Miss Vance," Julian said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a resonant timbre that filled the silent room, each word imbued with weight and authority. He spoke to her as if they were the only two people there. He then extended a gloved hand, not in a gesture of possession as Preston had done, but as a formal, almost courtly invitation. "If you wish," he said, the offer hanging in the air like a perfect, sustained note, "the grandest stage in this city, the Metropolitan Opera House, will be yours tomorrow night. I will clear their schedule." The statement was so audacious, so utterly demonstrative of his power, that a new wave of gasps rippled through the audience. Clearing the Met's schedule was not something one simply did. It was akin to rerouting a force of nature. It was not a boast. It was a fact. And with that fact, the final remnants of Preston Sterling's world shattered. He stood frozen, his hands clenched into useless fists at his sides, his face a ghastly shade of pale. Julian Thorne had not even deigned to look at him, yet with a few simple words, he had rendered him completely and utterly insignificant. Alara looked at the offered hand, then back at Julian's face. She didn't smile. She didn't weep with gratitude. She simply gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. She placed her hand in his, and the contact was a quiet affirmation, a pact made between two sovereigns of their respective worlds. The applause that erupted this time was different. It was no longer an apology. It was a coronation. It roared through the hall, a genuine, overwhelming tribute to the woman they had scorned just minutes before. The mockers shrank back into their seats, their faces burning with the shame of their own pettiness. Genevieve, the woman in the diamond collar, looked away, her fingers twisting a silk napkin into a mangled knot. Cade, the tech founder, stared at his shoes. The MC who had called her a comedy act fumbled with his microphone, his face ashen, knowing his career had just ended. But the story, the real story, was not about their fall. It was about her rise. The consequences for the mockers came not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating swiftness. The next morning, headlines blazed across every news site. The ghost of the gala, waitress revealed as world champion in stunning rebuke to billionaire. The video of Alara's dance went viral, juxtaposed with clips of Preston's sneering face. He became an overnight pariah, a meme for arrogant cruelty. Nexus Dynamics stock took a nosedive as a major ethics-focused pension fund, whose director sat on the board of the Met, publicly announced they were divesting. It was a move Julian Thorne neither confirmed nor denied orchestrating. Preston lost his board seat by the end of the week. Genevieve found her invitations to the season's most exclusive events rescinded without explanation. Cade's startup lost a crucial round of funding when the venture capitalist saw the footage and decided he lacked the emotional intelligence to be a leader. The man in the navy blazer was quietly asked to resign from his firm. The reporter's snarky article was buried. It wasn't revenge. It was simply the world recalibrating itself around the truth. Alara saw none of this. She didn't read the headlines or check her phone. The morning after the gala, she did not go to the Metropolitan Opera House. Instead, she took a subway train to Brooklyn, to a small, unassuming building tucked between a laundromat and a bakery. The sign above the door, faded and peeling, read, Clara Vance School of Dance. It had been closed for 7 years. She unlocked the door, the key turning with a stiff, protesting squeak. Inside, the air was still and thick with the dust of dormant memories. A fine gray powder coated the practice bar, the scuffed wooden floor, and the wall of mirrors that reflected a ghostlier version of herself. It was the studio her older sister, Clara, had poured her life savings into. A place meant to be a haven for kids who dreamed of dancing but couldn't afford the sky-high fees of Manhattan schools. Clara had been her biggest champion, the one who drove her to lessons at dawn, who coached her through every moment of doubt, who had been driving home from the airport after Ilara's Vienna triumph when a drunk driver ran a red light. Ilara had walked away from the stage that night and had never looked back, the guilt and grief a weight too heavy for any spotlight to penetrate. She stood in the center of the dusty room, the city's noise, a distant hum. She didn't need the grand stage Julian Thorne had offered, not anymore. She had been building something else all along, brick by silent brick of endurance. She was not reclaiming a crown she had lost. She was forging a new one from the ashes of her past. A few weeks later, a note arrived at the reopened, now clean studio. It was on expensive cream-colored stationery, the handwriting elegant. I was at the gala, it read. I was wrong. I laughed when I should have been silent. You reminded me what grace looks like. I have made a donation to the school in your sister's name. It is not enough, but it is a start. It was unsigned. The studio flourished. It became a home not for future champions, but for children who simply needed a safe place to find joy in movement. Ilara taught them, her voice soft but firm, correcting a posture with a gentle touch, sharing the gift that had been both her glory and her burden. One evening, as she was locking up, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and Julian Thorne looked out. He didn't ask her why she had turned down his offer. He already knew. Great artists don't always need great stages, he said, a respectful smile touching his lips. Sometimes they need to build their own. He gestured to a man in the passenger seat, who got out and handed Ilara a large, sealed envelope. My foundation's board has approved a permanent, unconditional endowment for this school. Teach them well, Miss Vance. Ilara took the envelope, her fingers tracing her sister's name on the faded sign above the door. The city lights were beginning to blur around her, but her steps had never felt more sure. She had been judged for her uniform, for her silence, for the life she had chosen in the shadows. But in the end, it was not their judgment that defined her. It was her own quiet, unyielding grace. She hadn't needed to crush them. She had simply needed to dance, and in doing so, she had reminded a glittering, hollow world that the truest value, the most powerful currency, lies not in what you own, but in who you are.